If you've been following my series on the Rings of Power for any length of time, you know that we have discussed at various points along the way Simon Tolkien and the Tolkien estate and the role they have played in the Rings of Power. More importantly, the fact that while it was under Christopher Tolkien's hands and under his guidance, they were still using Tom Shippey, who was helping sort of act as the front man between the Tolkien estate and Amazon and making sure that all things related to the books were navigated according to the rights that they had available to them and that they stuck to the existing established lore. Christopher Tolkien passed. They immediately fired Tom Shippey, and suddenly Simon Tolkien is the name that is continually being mentioned in all of the interviews being done about the Rings of Power. And we see Payne and McKay constantly talking up Simon Tolkien and how Simon Tolkien did this for us, Simon Tolkien did that for us, Simon Tolkien helped us navigate the rights to this, helped us come up with this, consulted with us here, did this and this and this. This is the name we see coming up over and over and over. And yet, back in 2012, which is the great part about the internet because you can find stuff like this, he was out there complaining that being Tolkien's grandson blocked my writing, and he gave an interview with The Guardian during which he stated that he very much felt held back by his grandfather's name and felt that it was not fair that his grandfather was this big famous person and that his writing career was overshadowed by that. He was never going to be able to get his own career off the ground. Now, flash forward 12 years, 10 years, or whatever, and here we are, and he is financially benefiting from the fact that his father is a famous author and the fact that he is now at the head of a massive multi-million dollar corporation that is exploiting, rightfully so, because they are the family behind it, but whether they're doing it in a manner that is, giving justice to the Tolkien legacy is another thing entirely. Be that as it may, he went from complaining about being the son of a famous person to being happy to be the son of a famous person. And it's kind of funny how a few $1,000,000 will change that for you. We're going to be diving into this today. I'm Tim Anderson, aka Renfail, the bearded dwarven princess, for those of you who might not know. And if this is your first time here, prerequisite, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon so you get more like this. Don't forget to also check out Mondays in Middle-earth every Monday morning at 11 a.m. Central as we read through The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion to better analyze the Rings of Power and all other things related to Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, and Middle-earth. In the meantime, however, let's go ahead and dive deeper into this. This interview was given back around the time that the Hobbit film was first being released, so it is a little dated now, about 10 years old, but it still is a great insight into a man who paints the picture of a family that was once torn apart. He and his father were famously at odds with each other during the production of Peter Jackson's films because Christopher Tolkien was of the opinion that they were impossible to film and the fact that the family wasn't consulted on anything. And Peter Jackson was very much in the public saying, well, you know what? We bought the rights to this free and clear, so we kind of have the right to do what we want in adapting this. We'd love for you to be involved, but only if you're going to be a willing participant. If you don't want to be a willing participant, then fine, we're just going to do it without you. And Christopher Tolkien very much said, fine, then do it without me. Simon Tolkien, on the other hand, very much wanted to be involved and attempted to be involved to the point where his father publicly basically disinherited him. And then eventually they patched things up. And they do say here, as of this writing, which is back in 2012, around the time The Hobbit was coming out, he and Christopher seem to have patched up their differences, and his new book is even dedicated to his father. It says, meanwhile, the lawsuit between the family and the film company was settled because basically Christopher Tolkien was upset that they weren't making any money off the New Line productions, and they sued, and there was an out-of-court settlement. The Hobbit film, An Unexpected Journey, is launching next month, and he just says, fathers and sons have their ups and downs, is all he's prepared to say on the subject. And he says, these days I see quite a lot of my father, especially given that he lives in France and I live in California. He goes on to say then that the Hobbit films, or excuse me, the Lord of the Rings films becoming famous was a detriment to his son, who was picked on and called a hobbit in class, but that his daughter has no such qualms because by the time that she grew up and was ready to start realizing what the family name meant, those films had been a global hit, and now she's in school growing up and the Hobbit films are out, and she's more than happy to be known as a famous person because she lives in California, and she's growing up to be one of those socialites. For Simon, this is the part where we get into the interesting, juicy stuff. Tolkien's fame meant that for a long time he felt that he was just the grandson. He studied at Oxford, which is where his grandfather was a professor, and his father a fellow. And he went on to become a barrister, which is a lawyer, essentially, despite harboring ambitions to be a writer himself. He says, being Tolkien's grandson blocked my writing. I found it very inhibiting that I was the grandson of such a genius. I thought it would be impossible for me to do anything creative because I couldn't possibly match up to him. Now, here's the thing. Other famous authors, I should say, have had progeny who go on to follow in their footsteps. One of the most famous is Stephen King's son. And I've always loved this story because Stephen King's son never attempted to use the family name to publish anything. He used a different name, a pen name, and went on to establish a writing career for himself, independent of his father, for many years before anyone realized that he was actually Stephen King's son. And since then, I believe they've gone on to collaborate on a couple of things, but he just basically studied at his craft. Went out there, did it, didn't pay attention to the fact that his father was someone famous, but just went out there and honed his own craft, became his own man, did his own thing, and never let the family's legacy bother him one little bit. Meanwhile, we have Simon Tolkien, who constantly is complaining that the family name was what was hindering him and not letting him be creative enough because he was always worried about, I'm never going to be able to be as good as my grandfather and no one's ever going to want to read my books in the same way, which for me is just an excuse. You can have famous people for parents or not, but if you're not willing to go out there and be creative, that's on you. That's not on your family name. Says he's very close to his Tolkien grandparents. He says, I was an only child, and my parents got divorced when I was 5. I lived with my mother in a small village outside Oxford and spent quite a bit of time with my grandparents. He says, my grandfather was a very patient person, a very affectionate person, and we had many happy hours together. He says it wasn't until he was 40 that he tried his hand at fiction. He says, ironically, says though he was trying to get away from being Tolkien's grandson, his name opened doors with agents and publishers. They would have loved me to have written fantasy fiction because that would have been easier to sell from a Tolkien, but I wanted to write thrillers. So hang on. He said even though he was trying to get away from being Tolkien's grandson, Tolkien's name opened doors with agents and publishers. Hold up. Wait a minute. So on the one hand, he complains that being Tolkien's grandson blocked my writing, but in the same breath says, but I also leveraged the family name to get in with agents and publishers. So what he's saying is, if it weren't for the family name, he might not have been able to get published in the first place. We don't know that for certain, but here's a man who clearly was not willing to try to do it on his own, to do it with a pen name, to go out there and just be a creative individual and see if he could make it or break it on his own. Instead, he wanted to use the name of the family to get in the door with agents and publishers and make a name for himself while leveraging the family legacy. You kind of lose the right to complain about your grandfather's name blocking you from being the creative individual that you want when you then go out and use the family name to try to make yourself famous. And this is where, in my mind, this is the breaking point where you can clearly see that this man has one objective in mind, and that is the financial opportunities that come with being a Tolkien heir. Now, I'm going to say this in public. If I was a Tolkien heir, I also would not be afraid to leverage the family name for profit. But I would not be out there making claims that the family name is somehow hindering me from becoming a better person. I would be out there working with anybody and anyone willing to do so to try to make the best adaptations and to create as many things, whether it's video games or TV shows or whatever, that are accurate to the source material. And I would want to very much be involved in that process. But that's also because I'm coming at this from this perspective of having been in that position and adapting literary properties for video games and doing short stories and video game production and also doing, fantasy fiction and also doing science fiction and doing travel writing and all this other stuff. So I've been around the block long enough to know how to kind of maneuver in that environment. Even though I've never done big Hollywood deals, that's definitely out of my wheelhouse. the exploitation of an IP is something that I'm intimately familiar with because that's just what I've been doing for 15 years now in terms of creating worlds and selling them on social media and figuring out creative ways to make money off of those things. That's how I've made a living for 15 years. Um, the current project being no exception. Like we're working on this with my brother and my wife. It's a fifth edition tabletop setting, a book series, and a point and click adventure game. And those are just the first three things that we're doing. Out of that, we're spinning off other things. We have the Twitch streams on Sunday nights. We have the YouTube channel. I mean, there's multiple. I mean, if you really want to dive into it, there's probably about a dozen different revenue streams that we're bringing in from a world setting. And so that's something that I'm familiar with doing. And if I was in the Tolkien estate as an heir, I would be absolutely doing the same damn thing, but I would not be out there saying that the family's name is keeping me from being the writer that I always wanted to be until it's time to get a paycheck, and then he's more than happy to use the family name. Now, how does this matter when it's a 10-year-old video? Well, if you've watched any of my other content, you know that we've been going on this ongoing series of, the Tolkien estate, specifically Simon Tolkien having the power to veto. He's been working hand in hand with Payne and McKay, helping them navigate the rights issues. He's been mentioned in almost every interview that Payne and McKay have given about their interactions with the Tolkien estate. Oh, we greeted Simon Tolkien in Elvish, and that's how we were able to get the contract. And Simon Tolkien has been a great consulting uh, help with us to get the show right and all these things. A lot of the issues that people have with the show not following the lore established by existing Tolkien publications is because it doesn't. And those changes have been because of Simon Tolkien, as far as we understand things, because Christopher Tolkien is no longer around. And the moment that Christopher Tolkien was dead, Amazon fired Tom Shippey, who is the resident Tolkien expert keeping them on track according to Tolkien lore, and they went straight to Simon Tolkien, who they knew was a more manipulative individual who clearly cares about one thing, and that is leveraging the family name to get rich. Now, is there anything wrong with that? No! I would do the same thing, but at least be honest about it. Don't try to act like, oh, the family name's holding me back until you need to use the family name to try to make a buck. That's the issue that I have. Just be honest about it. Go out there and say, absolutely, we're going to milk this for all it's worth. I'm going to be at the forefront. I'm going to be helping guide all this stuff, and I'm going to be trying to make as much money as possible for the family. That would be honest. It might not be something we all agree with, but it would be honest, and that would be the most important thing in my mind. Anyway, food for thought. I thought this was a very interesting read. It gives a little more insight into what's going on with the Tolkien estate and Simon Tolkien and everything that they are doing with the Rings of Power show, and how he went from someone who didn't want to be associated with the Tolkien name to be very happy being associated with the Tolkien name because now he's at the head of everything. Like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, support if you can. It's super easy. On a premiere like this, I'm down there in the chat hanging out with people chatting, and you can ask questions, interact with me, drop a super chat or a sticker to support. You can also do a super thanks one-off after the video's been uploaded. Join as a member. We have 3 different tiers down there, and there's the aforementioned Patreon page. Check all that stuff out, and I'll see everybody in the next episode, and hopefully I'll see you in the next Monday Musings episode as well every Monday at 11 a.m. Happy reading, everybody.